I first met tonight's speaker in 2020 when she was asked to speak at a large Zoom meeting run every month by the National Park Service. We are actually part of the National Park Service. We are a trail called the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Route, aka W3R.
So, of course, what is one of the main themes of that history that played out right here in many of your backyards? So we've been thrilled over the years to see new faces every year and have very dedicated, regular, repeat visitors to our events. One of the historians with the Ken Burns Project. Iris, thank you.
Thank you. So thank you so much to Connie and Susan, Constance Kehoe and Susan Seal, for inviting me today. And thank you all for coming in the dark, rainy night of today. So I'm very grateful, of course, to both the Odell House and Revolutionary Westchester 250, because you've supported me since many years by now, and we've done many programs together. You showed me around to all the locations that I'm writing about, that I'm researching. So I'm very grateful for our relationship and our friendship. So thank you so much. And for always having nice dinners together and staying at your homes and everything. So it's been very, very nice. Thank you. Yeah, good guest rooms. Yeah. And so today I want to talk to you about where we are, the location of this library, Greenburgh and surroundings as well. There's, of course, a map here that we can study in depth later. Because you might not realize, but we are here on the grounds of the 6 weeks that changed the American Revolution, that really turned a lot of things around and made victory possible. So we're going to focus on that today, of course. And so that's what I said, the decisions here shaped the end of the war. And of course, it's a very French-American story, which is why I'm going to focus on, of course, the French mainly, as I've done in the Ken Burns documentary. And we have a little problem because the sound is not working. So we can still watch, you know, if you remember, have seen it, you'll remember parts, but I'm not going to show all the clips I had planned because the sound doesn't work. But you can, of course, go online, PBS, and stream it tonight if you want. But I'll just play this a bit. You might hear my computer, you know, little music. But you might remember that there were a few moments in the movie or in the documentary that really referred to France. And so, of course, we started with the secret aid that French provided. So this is Vergennes, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, that, of course, orchestrated the alliance with America, so between France and America during the American Revolution. And so it really focuses on the small beginnings of that aid that were all secret. And then, of course, we go on and on to discuss why they helped, but especially how they helped. And then we have this whole part discussing especially Yorktown. And so I wanted to show you this excerpt just to get us into the atmosphere of the Ken Burns documentary. And of course, I've been asked to talk a little bit about that experience today, of how that was, how we filmed. And so I will start with that. Well, let's skip the video because there's no sound. So here we can see the early beginnings of all that. And so I will talk just a bit about the filming first, but then we'll focus on why I've been studying the French. And then I will tell you what happened here. The story of why I studied the French is always a question I got asked, because if you know accents, I don't have a French accent, I have a Dutch accent, which is great to be here in, you know, my land, let's say New York, very Dutch. It's always fun to see all these names here, 'cause it's so Dutch. So here we go. So we can see the photos here of filming the documentary. And so this was done at Francis Tavern, which you all know, of course, in New York City, which today is still a tavern. I actually personally quite like that little pub area, but of course also the museum, remembering George Washington's inauguration and all that. And so with Ken Burns and Sarah Botstein, we were there to film the interview, which happened about 3 years ago. So that is also maybe interesting to know. They've, of course, worked on this documentary film for 10 years. And so a lot of the interviews were done quite a while ago. Some of us have changed quite a bit. Up to you to judge if I did. But so it's been really an interesting process for me, especially because, of course, I knew Ken Burns. Also in Europe, he is well known for Vietnam, for the Civil War. And so for me to be, invited to come to this interview and to spend time as well afterwards in the studio to watch the episodes and to give some advice or say what I thought about it was also, of course, a very exciting experience, especially for myself as I'm, of course, one of the younger scholars working on this. It is a great boost for my career. I can tell you that. I'll tell you more about that later, but it's been really wonderful to have such a large audience for the research I've been doing for over 10 years. And so, yeah, you can also see with the team there, this is with David Schmidt and Sarah Botzing, of course, and Frederike Beer, who is the one that is commenting a lot on the Germans, right? She wrote a book about Hessians, and she's also in the documentary. So I'm happy to reply to any questions later about how that all was, but personally, I'm still very excited that that is now on TV and that you can stream it. And apparently 10 million people already watched the first episodes at the beginning, and the numbers are coming up very fast. So good news. So now I'm going to tell you why I studied mainly the French. So my focus has been for many years the French in the American Revolution. So that means, of course, the French aid to the Americans during the American Revolutionary War. And the reason is that I grew up here. This is in Burgundy. So I'm from the Netherlands, but my parents bought a holiday home, which you can see on the photo. And as you might notice, there's a huge tree. And so this tree is called a tulip poplar tree. And that's really how the story of my research began and my interest in the American Revolution started. Some of you already know the story, but we'll tell it again. Some have even been to the place I'll talk about soon. And so I grew up under this tulip poplar tree, and people told me in the village it was planted by Lafayette himself. Mm-hmm. He came back from the American Revolution. He had a little tree and decided to plant it in our garden. So I've always heard that is the Lafayette tree. And so we've done many events and dinners and parties under the tree because it's such a prominent thing in my garden. But when I grew up, I wanted to know if it were actually true. And so Lafayette never set foot in my garden, nor in the entire... Yeah. He's never been to Burgundy even, so... But someone else did, and that's his uncle. And so his uncle is called François-Jean de Châtelus. You've never heard of him, probably, but you will after this. And so his uncle actually did plant that tree. He came back from the American Revolution, where he served as a major general under General Rochambeau. And the trees were given to him by George Washington himself from Mount Vernon. And so when I found that's part of the story in a local archive, because someone had written about that to the owner of my home, and at the time of that particular moment that the tree was planted. So when I found that story, I realized there's a castle called Châtelus next to our home, or close by, in a village called Châtelus, and the owner is still Philippe de Châtelus, so he's a descendant. And so when I visited the castle for the first time, of course, I talked to him about my tree, and I said that we had this tree and I thought it was planted by one of his ancestors. And then Philippe got really excited because he said, I have the same tree in my garden. We have a tulip poplar. And I know for a fact Washington gave it to François-Jean. And that's how it all started for me. I got really inspired and I wanted to know, of course, much more about Châtelus. Who was this man? Why did he bring a tree back from George Washington to my garden? So that led a few years later to coming back when I was doing a master degree in history to ask Philippe if he had more information on that particular man, François-Jean de Châtelus. Then he said, well, I might, but I'm not very sure because we have 1,000 years of family archives. It's, to be clear, it's actually 700 years, but the family owns the same castle for 1,000 years. Not an exaggeration, it's the case. And so he said, so we have an archive tower, but I'm not really sure what we have in it. So your story, we might find something about it, we might not, but let's try. And that's when we found this archival treasure in this castle, the Château de Châtelus, and we're now flying in the archive. Here you are, and there I am, sitting. And so what I found was 6,000 pages of letters, including 12 manuscript unpublished letters of George Washington, and then 8 of Thomas Jefferson, and many others of Franklin and Adams and Madison, and Lafayette and Rochambeau, and everyone else you can imagine of the American Revolution. And so this treasure literally was just hiding in that archive, and the family was not aware that they owned it for so many years. And so when I found that, I of course decided to continue my research. It was a little hard because the rest of the family did not want me to do the research. I had to convince them, which took 2 years. But finally, I got in to do the real research, which took several years to understand this massive collection. Because of course, as I said, it had the letters of Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin that you can see. But it also had letters of Voltaire, the French philosopher, Diderot, d'Alembert, David Hume, Jeremy Bentham, and many other philosophers. So you had the American Revolution, but you also had the Enlightenment. So this collection was absolutely impressive. It also took a lot of years to understand it and study it. Sometimes I found it too long, but it was, of course, really the discovery of my life, because I've been working on this since now about, 14 years, and it's still continuing to give more and always new things to be found. And so I could talk on and on about the archive, but I want to focus on, okay, who is François-Jean de Châtelus? And then we're going to focus on what did he do here in Greenburgh and the surroundings of Westchester County. And so we can start with a quote from himself that I found in the archive. What's really great is almost everything he did is in the archive. So it starts when he was about 8 years old up until his death, and he wrote about every day of his life. So he writes in one point to Jeremy Bentham. Oh, there's a little thing. So Jeremy Bentham, he writes that, so you ask me who I am. There was a letter from Jeremy Bentham that asked that. So can you describe yourself? And so he describes himself as both a soldier and as like a person of the Republic of Letters. And so that means, of course, the Enlightenment. As I have already said, the archive reflected that, but he himself characterizes himself as someone who was part of the French army, as well as someone who was active in the enlightened sphere, and also actually was recognized as such by the Académie Française, which is, of course, really the center of the French enlightened figures, and there's 40 immortals that represent that, and so he was one of the 40 immortals alongside Voltaire and Montesquieu. And so he says, my fortune is very thin, and my real wealth is that I have friends. And indeed, he never had a lot of money because he was the youngest son of his family, but he had a lot of friends, and that makes him indeed very interesting, including Washington and Jefferson and Franklin. And so as a soldier, he spent almost his entire life. He was 12 years old when he entered the army, and of course continued up until the end of his life. And he had quite an illustrious career because he came from one of the most illustrious French military families, called Châtelus, of course, who were known to be soldiers of all the French kings since the very early Middle Ages. So he fought mainly in the 7 Years' War, which we, of course, know here as the French and Indian War, but he played a role of starting as a lieutenant and rose to a colonel of his own regiment called the Régiment de Châtelus. And so he was fighting alongside two interesting figures that we'll hear more about soon. One you recognize, of course, Rochambeau. So he was fighting alongside Rochambeau for many years during the 7 Years' War. They were at the same battles. They were even in the same regiments, and they became head of two regiments, and then they swapped the regiments. So they knew each other very well from this period. That is relevant because they're going to work together again during the American Revolution. As you know, Rochambeau was the general of the campaign, and they were right here. La Luzerne is also someone you might not know, but he is a French ambassador of the time of the American Revolution. He was also fighting alongside Châtelus during the 7 Years' War. I'm saying this because some people were already very used to working together, and that becomes relevant for the American Revolution, as of course they had to fight together here alongside Washington. And so as the member of the Republic of Letters, Châtelus the philosopher was indeed a very well-respected, recognized philosopher of the Enlightenment. He wrote books that are today completely forgotten, but at the time were quite well known, especially the one in the middle, which is called De la félicité publique, which means on public happiness. He wrote about the concept of happiness in 1772. So that is 4 years before the Declaration of Independence, and actually the translation in English circulated in America from 1774 onwards. So he did inspire the founding fathers and their thoughts on happiness, the happiness of an entire society, not happiness as we would consider your personal happiness. Another topic I could go on for about 2 hours, but the point is he is famous as a philosopher of that time and was already recognized before he would arrive in America as one. I already spoke a little bit about this, but the fact he is the uncle by marriage of Lafayette is also relevant for later in the American Revolution. And so it's a very long story to explain a family tree, but what you have to remember is he was the uncle of Adrienne de Noailles, who is Lafayette's wife, maternal uncle. So they knew each other from very early ages because Châteauroux was in the same army, in the same regiment as Lafayette's father. So when he was killed during the 7 Years' War at the Battle of Minden in Germany, Châteauroux saw Lafayette's father die. He writes about that. And so later, when he marries his niece, when she is 14 and Lafayette is 16, he is at the wedding and from then onwards becomes a mentor figure for Lafayette. That is, of course, relevant for the American Revolution, as Lafayette is such a symbol for the French-American relations, but around Lafayette were a lot of others, and he is really one of the more prominent one later. And so I wrote a biography on Châteauroux, so his whole life is described in my book that you could read if you speak French. His entire life is really interesting for especially what I find his networks, his connections to all these different locations and people. And it really serves as a study to show how ideas are circulating in the Atlantic world. But we're going to focus obviously on just the revolution. So here's another excerpt of Ken Burns's film without sound, but it's this one. The first excerpt I wanted to show was about the French-American alliance, especially before the official alliance. So that means the secret aid that the French sent. Just to remind you that we have, of course, from the 1775 onwards, the French are already interested in the American Revolution and are sending weapons, are sending money, they're sending gunpowder. In 77, Lafayette comes in, and in 1778, the French-American alliance is signed, the moment you can see here, which is, of course, a very important moment for the cause of the American Revolution, because from a local rebellion, it becomes a world war. France enters the war, and it becomes very important, of course, because the British now have to fight the French and not just the Americans. There's, of course, also Spain is involved, the Netherlands are involved, but the French alliance is really a key turning point for the cause of the American Revolution, because without the French army, they could not win. They don't have enough weapons, they don't have enough money, they don't have a fleet, and they also don't have the expertise to fight the very well-trained British army. We can talk about the reasons why France is involved. The main reason, of course, being they lost the 7 Years' War. The balance of power of Europe is going very much towards the British, and so this is the moment where France believes that if we help America or the American Revolution, the balance could be retilted back towards the French glory of before. They want, of course, more power, let's say it that way, and they want to diminish the British one. Some people are also inspired by the cause. One of them is Châteauroux, because since the early beginnings, he's studying the revolution. And in his 1776 edition of that book that I referenced, the On Public Happiness, he writes many pages on the promise of the American Revolution and how that is really the dream for the humanity, for everyone to have a new form of society that he's seeing to develop under his eyes. Most French officers are not that excited about the whole cause. They're more just there to fight the British. So Rochambeau's campaign is, of course, someone most of people, I would assume, in the room know a lot about. So I don't have to go through all the details, but we will, of course, focus on the 6 weeks that happened right here. And so you can also see they arrived in July of 1780. So I mentioned the alliance was signed in 1778. There has been a first campaign sent under Admiral d'Estaing. He lost in Newport, Rhode Island, and he also lost in Savannah. That's also in Ken Burns' film. There's a lot about Savannah, so you could watch that. But the point is, d'Estaing loses quite badly. The French-American alliance is very unpopular at that particular moment because they had high hopes for this aid, and then the French army that actually came and the fleet could not win. So the second expedition was, of course, there were high stakes. What were they going to do to change the situation? And so one of the reasons Rochambeau was chosen, as well as Châteauneuf and two others called the Viaumenil brothers, they were chosen to lead this army because they had already worked together and they were really well known to be people that were very flexible. They would adapt much better to a new culture, and they had experience to fight with allies. That was not the case of the previous one, because he was more interested in just being the leader instead of working with the Americans. And that's a really important point why they could finally win at the end. And so Châteauneuf arrives with Rochambeau in 1780, and where we're going to focus on now, 1781, in the summer of 1781, when they came here, was a very tough moment in the American Revolution. We all know that, of course, there were several high moments and a lot of lower moments during the Revolution. The year of 1781 started very bad for the cause. British, of course, were really very strong in New York, and just they couldn't get defeated there. The American morale in general was really collapsing. Their finances were not good. And of course, French aid had come, but there was a lot of uncertainty if they would actually be able to flip the situation. And of course, all sides, both the French and Americans, had a very serious lack of resources. The resources, I mean by money, but also just the fleet was not there. The French fleet was promised, they weren't there really. It was very complicated. They couldn't really fight a war at the time. The French-American alliance, again, it was they had had no joint operations. They had been there for almost a year. So when they would arrive here in 1781, they arrived in 1780. And for about 11 months, the French were just waiting to get more reinforcements. So the Americans, and especially George Washington, as you can imagine, grew quite frustrated. He had hoped to get French aid, and it had failed twice, and now they're just waiting for 11 months. So it was a really tough situation. One of the most important differences and problems were that they, of course, had been enemies during the 7 Years' War. Americans had been fighting against French. So these prejudices and problems and traumas were still very much in people's minds. The armies were very different, of course, because you had a very highly trained French army, and then you had the American younger army that was rapidly developing, but they were not at the same level as the French training. And then cultural, social, language, religious differences between these two people. So it was very hard to work together, of course. Châteauneuf is not amused when he arrived. He is writing, we wanted to crush the English, we thought the occasion favorable. But all in all, we have contracted an alliance with rebel subjects. We'll have to feed, clothe, pay the Americans, and even fight for them. We are misled by Congress and greedy merchants. So this is at the beginning of his arrival. This is September 1780. He wants to leave. He writes to the king, can you please bring me back to France? Luckily, the letter arrived very late, so he got a reply after Yorktown, so that was good. So he had to stay. He also believes that the French are not giving enough aid. It's mediocre, according to him. The aid we send to America is very mediocre and unlikely to give an advantageous opinion on our strength to our new ally. It's really very tough for him. The other problem is, again, they don't have men, they don't have money, they don't have ships, they cannot do anything. But the big debate starts between Washington and Rochambeau. Are we going to New York City to attack the British, or are we going somewhere else? You can often read and hear that the winter that followed that moment was a period of waiting, of doing nothing, and of just waiting for reinforcement. Washington would have been obsessed by New York, while Rochambeau sort of manipulated him to go to Yorktown later. Or it's often presented as de Grasse's initiative, so the French admiral that would come later. But if you start to look at all these sources from Châteauroux, it's much more nuanced. And one of the main things that I found is that it's a much longer process than is often assumed. The decision to go to Yorktown was not only taken in a few weeks, it was taken almost over a year, and it was even prepared for over a year. And it was very rational, and it was very collaborative between Washington and Rochambeau. It's not a question of manipulation or sort of lurking him into the whole thing. It's really, you can see it was a very deliberate choice. And one of the people behind that choice was Châteauroux. And so his main solution of this very desperate situation of 1780 and the winter of 81, instead of just waiting for ships and more men, he decided to go on a research mission. And as we remember, he's a philosopher, so he believes in the power of research. He is not just sitting idle waiting, he is thinking we have to gather all the information we can to do research. And to then understand the war, we have to understand the people, and we also especially have to understand battlefields. What have they done before? What can we learn from the past failures or successes? And so he goes out with the whole team to do this research, and he's going to meet almost all the American leaders to talk to them in person. And so he goes on different missions, and one of them is the one we're focusing on here because it's coming, don't worry. I just need a lot of information before you understand what's happening. But so the one in New York is also part of this research mission. He really believes that without intelligence, we can't do this. And that sounds very normal to us today, but during that particular moment in the 18th century, it was not that common to start to research all the elements that he was researching. He was studying religion, he was studying the people, what they would eat, their customs, why they were fighting, what's all going on, right? He really wanted to understand. And so he went to lots of locations, you can see on the slide, and traveled with many people. You can also see on the slide all their names. And so you can see from the American side that Knox, Hamilton, Heath, Humphrey, Stillman, Lawrence, Lafayette, Washington, Jefferson, all these people were involved in this research mission. One of the most important real turning points for Châteauroux was to meet George Washington himself. He, as I said before, was frustrated. He didn't believe in the opportunity or possibility to win. He didn't believe in the American leaders, nor in their soldiers. It was all very sad, he thought. But when he met Washington, it all changed out of a sudden in a minute. So he met him here at the Dye Mansion in New Jersey. I mean, here, the photo of that building that still exists today. And so it was Lafayette, his nephew, as we remember, that introduced Washington to Châteauroux. And there's a very long description in his travel diary that is, you can see the printed version and the manuscript version here, where he describes his first encounter and the 4 days that he spent afterwards in the Dye Mansion. And it's a moment where two men really found each other. Washington was frustrated by the French. He didn't have much hopes either. He was very frustrated during that particular time when they met, which is November 1780. Châteauroux was, as we know, as well. So both were a little suspicious first, but as soon as they started to talk to each other, like a real deep relationship evolved between these two. They had this dinner here at this table. They cracked a lot of nuts, that's what they say, like with a hammer. And especially they drank a lot of port and Madeira, which Châteauroux accelerated the acquaintances. And I'll come back to the relationship between the two, but the first 4 days would really be a turning point for both Châteauroux and Washington, because Washington finally, by the way, spoke for the first time directly to one of them, because he spoke English very well. Very important part of the story. But the most important was that they really found each other in many other things. They had both fought the 7 Years' War and had lots of frustrations within their own army, so they were pining over that. They had lost their fathers young, they had lost brothers young, they had studied a lot themselves. They were the younger sons of their family, had to fight for their own wealth. All these type of things bound them. Another one was really their belief in the Enlightenment. They were very hopeful for the progress of humanity, not just for the revolution, but also for the entire political systems in the world. Global trade they were dreaming of. They were sharing a lot on theater and on music as well. So they had a lot in common. That was probably quite surprising for both of them. But for them, it was really a moment where that mistrust between the French and Americans could disappear a bit because these two leaders really found each other. And so when Chateauneuf came back from his research missions along about 6 different states, he was convinced there was excellent leadership. Washington and those that he had met around him were actually really good leaders. And he even says it actually really merits the praises of Europeans, this entire army. So instead of looking at it as the ragtag army that he had seen maybe in Rhode Island, as soon as he started to really study them, they were very different than the French, but they were actually really good at what they were doing themselves, and he was very impressed. Then he could also see they had a lot of common interests in, as I said before, the political ideals, agriculture, trade, science, and arts. So instead of being very different, they started to look for common ground. So this is, I would argue, one of the binding factors of the alliance and why things would go well here in Greenburgh, where we're going. So at one point in May 1781, this whole winter has passed, there's new hope because there's news that the French fleet is going to arrive. The big debate continues. Are we going to attack New York City or are we going somewhere in the south? They really do not, they cannot make this plan because they still don't know the numbers of soldiers available to them. But they still decide to move to New York just to see what, if there's an option, they would attack, and otherwise they would just go further down. So the French decide to go to New York at this moment. And so they will arrive right here on July 6th. And Washington was already here with his troops. So it's the first moment where the French and American armies are going to junction. They're going to be together in order to then start an operation. They don't know which one exactly yet, but they will do at least something. This is the first time that the French actually started to move. They were in Newport, Rhode Island for 11 months. So lots of soldiers were very excited to finally be able to go and explore where they were. So it's also really an adventure for all the Frenchmen. Chateauneuf, of course, had already been here. He knew very well where they were going. And so when they arrive, there's, of course, the moment when some people are not very, they don't love the location, as you can see. A certain district containing only some hills and wasteland, almost uninhabited and full of heather and thorns. So von Closen is one of the officers and he's commenting on this location. But so of course what's happening is they need to make camp. So we're talking about 9,000 men that are going to be united here. There's about 5,000 French and about 4,000 Americans, and they have to camp because of course they need to eat and sleep and everything. But one of the things is they could not be together, they had to be separate. These are orders from the French king. They were not allowed to be in the same space because they would think the soldiers would fight each other. So they had to be separated. And there's even like little creeks and like things that would really separate them physically. And so they were encamped, you can find on the map, because I had to promote this map. Here we go. So in the map you can find on the table, you can bring it when you go after this. But so you can study and also visit all the locations that are relevant to this story. But so what I really think is interesting is that it covers a huge ground. You're thinking about 9,000 people. And as I said in one of these slides, it's a 4 miles long encampment, right? So if you have to imagine 9,000 people camping right here where we are, it's hard to imagine because it's, of course, not that much of a wasteland anymore. But it is really a very impressive camp. And so Washington is, of course, very excited that finally something is happening. There's hope. He had met Chateauneuf, he's a good friend of his in the meantime. He had met a lot of the other Frenchmen. And he really says, there's finally some hope, and we can hope for the happiest consequence to be expected in the future. They're doing a grand review of troops. So, of course, they're installing themselves in these camps. And then there's a moment when the Americans are going to see the parade of the French and vice versa. And so one of the officers is commenting that the troops are in their finest dress. Monsieur de Rochambeau positioned himself in front of the white flag of his senior regiment and saluted General Washington. So you have to imagine this huge sort of sea of white uniforms parading with feathers, and with the generals and officers are, of course, representing French aristocracy. They're very well dressed. They have wigs, they have heels on, even makeup, perfume, everything. For Americans, it was very impressive to see. Because especially the Continental Army soldiers were not as well dressed. They were pretty much naked. Their misery is at such point that 3/4 of them have no shoes. They trouble themselves little with provisions. Actually, they're given just a bit of cornmeal, of which each soldier makes his own bread. The French are quite shocked, but they will, as you'll see later, also be impressed by the same soldiers. But for them, it's hard to see the suffering of these soldiers while they actually are quite well fed and have their beautiful uniforms. Of course, it's a very nice day, but at the same time, it was also very hot, apparently, as we can see here. It was impossible to be more uncomfortable than we were that day. More than 400 soldiers dropped from fatigue. Because they had marched, you have to imagine, for many weeks already in this hot, humid climate. So, of course, when the soldiers were all taken care of, the same thing had to happen for the generals, so they would get their headquarters. Châteauneuf would get headquarters assigned very close to the headquarters of both Rochambeau and Washington, in a home that was recently sold. I remember that whole story. But so the home of Washington was here at, it was called the Appleby House. You might know where it is. I'm sure some of you do. And of course, Rochambeau stayed in the Odell House, which is, was David and Susan in the room, being heavily restored, and a great project to make this place come alive again and to celebrate Rochambeau and of course the Odell family that lived in the home, in a museum that will open soon, hopefully. No, but it's a wonderful project because it really celebrates and commemorates the moment of these 6 weeks where Rochambeau was in this area, and it will tell all about what happened and why that's relevant for the revolution. And on top of that, it will tell many other stories, of course, of those that lived in this very beautiful home. So please go look at the website of the Odell House soon. So when everyone was installed, of course, the main question was, what are we gonna do? The French were there, their fleet was about to come, they didn't really know where they would arrive, and Washington really wanted to take revenge for losing New York in 1776. He also wanted to attack, of course, the main power of the British. He thought, if we attack New York, we can win this entire war. If we don't, we might win a little battle, but it's not gonna really do much for us. He, however, still lacked resources. He didn't get the soldiers he hoped for from Congress, and he also didn't really know if the French fleet would actually arrive. They had sent letters to say in May that they would come, but you never know, right? In the 18th century, there's zero communication, so no one really knew. So the question was still, where are we gonna strike? And so there's correspondence and letters and also secret meetings that happened between Washington and Châteauneuf at this time. And it went so far that Washington started to write letters like this one about their very deep friendship that distance nor time can ever eradicate. I can truly say that never in my life did I part with a man to whom my soul clave more sincerely than it did to you. So he really trusted him, and he actually loved him in his own way. And so he was listening to Châteauneuf's advice, and this is when we start to talk about the Grande Reconnaissance that would happen, because as we know, Châteauneuf's favorite thing was to do research. He wanted to understand the war, he wanted to understand options. And when Washington was really fixed on New York, and Rochambeau was more like, oh, that's really gonna be a problem, and we don't have enough men, Châteauneuf knew Washington's mind and thought, if I'm gonna prove it to him and show him, he might change. And so they organized what you call the Reconnaissance in Force mission, which means that you're gonna feint an attack, and then when you do, your opponent is gonna show its weaknesses. Or where you could attack, or where you could especially not attack, was mainly it. And so there were different columns formed, and so I'm not going to explain the whole thing, but different columns would walk towards Manhattan, march there, and they would then, of course, start to, again, feint. It's not a real attack, but the British would think they were under attack, which would expose where they were located and what they would do as a reaction. And so there were a lot of difficulties because it was in the middle of the night, and it was a very tough march to go secretly closer to all these different fortifications. What I didn't say yet, but New York City was heavily fortified because the British had been there for many years. And so they wanted to understand the fortifications mainly. during this moment, von Closen, who at first commented that they were naked and in very sad conditions, he was saying now that he really admires them. It's incredible that soldiers composed of men of every age, even children of 15, of whites and blacks, almost naked, unpainted, rather poorly fed, can march so well and withstand fire so steadfastly. And so while they march towards the British defense lines, they of course get shot. The different bombardments are starting, different places are reacting, and so it's a dangerous mission. But at the end, there's not a lot of casualties, even none on the French and American side at the beginning. And so you have different columns doing different research missions. Washington and Rochambeau go on their own forward, and they're doing a lot of scouting and research to understand the fortifications and especially how to attack, if ever. Of course, the British start to really react, so it becomes almost a real battle, but the French are taking notes of everything that happens, and especially Châteauneuf is taking many notes, but of course, a lot of other engineers are too. They're drawing maps, they're studying, and they're really understanding New York City. There's been some moments that were quite scary and dangerous or violent, as you can see here. One of the Frenchmen shot someone, and then the other person started to shout, "Die, you dog of a Frenchman." And then the other guy, I got ahead of him, pulling a ball through his chest. So, of course, we're talking about a war, so there's casualties. Luckily, afterwards, they had a nice dinner. And so they would camp for so this is only a two-day expedition, by the way, and then a few days later, some other things happened, but it's really two nights, 2 days full of action, and they would camp. Here you can see on the slide where they would be camped at that time, and the 23rd, a new day would start where they would do much more research. One of the little anecdotes that you just need to tell is that Washington and Rochambeau nearly drowned, talking about things that could have gone very wrong. They were located, of course, so you can see here what's called Throg's Neck today. And so there's a whole description of Rochambeau explaining that they fell asleep on the little island. And without them knowing that it was not, they thought it was a peninsula, but it became like an island because the water came in. And so they were sleeping, and at one point Rochambeau wakes up and he's like, "Ah, we have to get out." And then they realize that the bridge they had taken is flooded, they can't leave. And so apparently little boats are coming to rescue them, but the little boats are being shot at, and on top of that, they can't really move. So there's horses that are going to pull them forward to be saved. So this is one of these moments, it could really have gone wrong. Imagine Washington and Rochambeau dead at this point. Not good for the next rest of the story. But I do love this moment because it tells you a lot about the human cost of all this too, because they didn't sleep for 2 nights, and at one point you sit down and they just fell asleep. So the conclusions are, they're known by other reports too, some other French engineers, and they've just not been studied much, but they're out there. But one of them is really the one from Châteauneuf who initiated the mission, who is describing that it's absolutely impossible to attack New York. It's in this beautiful, he had all these maps and then this report. And he explains that it is, you have to do 5 simultaneous attacks in ways that are literally impossible. He describes all different options. It's like 40 pages going on and on in detail. Very interesting if you really want to know everything about this. But then he says, the enemy would make our best hopes vanish in an instant. That's his main conclusion. We cannot attack New York. And what's so interesting about this is we always hear another date for decisions, but on August 1st, Washington writes, when he had just received that report, to say we should really pivot to the south. Then there's this whole question of when is the fleet going to arrive? They know the fleet will arrive, they don't know when, they don't know where. They have sent letters to direct them to the Chesapeake Bay. Washington himself did that as well. But so they are waiting. Can you imagine you have made a decision, but you have 2 weeks to wait because no information arrives. You're desperately looking for letters. So at one point, the letter arrives on August 14th at the Odell House, at Rochambeau's headquarters, saying De Grasse is actually going to arrive in the Chesapeake Bay. So for 2 weeks, they had been anxiously waiting for news, and here the letter came to say, we are going to the Chesapeake Bay. And then 2 days later, another letter arrived saying where Cornwallis was. So the British they didn't really know where the British were located either at this particular time. So the letter saying that he was actually fortifying himself in Yorktown was, of course, crucial information. They knew where they would attack in the south. That's often something you tend to forget because you just feel they went to Yorktown, but they did not know where Cornwallis was. So these are a lot of different pieces of a puzzle that actually is hard to explain in a short amount of time. So sorry if it was a lot of information. But what I wanted to really say is the decision to go to Yorktown was not an improvised reaction to de Grasse arriving, as it's very often described. It was not just a decision because they realized we're going there, or some sort of providential things. Some books do that too. It was just really a cooperation where Châteauroux advised, let's just research the question. Let's not sort of leave this to luck. We're gonna research, understand, and make a decision. Washington would listen to him because they had been so close for the few couple of months prior to that. And of course, Rochambeau was very much involved in all this too, and many others. But the key of that understanding of that alliance through Châteauroux is that friendship that made it possible for him to advise Washington. And so, of course, they left after 6 weeks. So we're talking about 6 weeks of encampment. And so, of course, the decision was made to go to Yorktown. But another thing was also happening is that the French and American troops were training here. They were training already prior to at other, like in Newport, but here it was the first time they could train together. They would get ready for Yorktown. And another thing is that the officers would have many dinners for over 6 weeks. So those that didn't know each other yet or still had some distrust really started to trust each other. And so these 6 weeks are not only important for the strategy, it's more important for the teamwork that would happen later. And then soldiers were trained together as well. So all this happened right here, which is so crucial because without these 6 weeks, who knows what would have happened later in the war. And so, of course, they have to make sure they move out fast and quickly and secretive. And so they leave a few people here to make the British believe that they're gonna still attack New York. They're brave, as some people here know, obviously, but you have the bread ovens are built. They're making fake ships and all that to make just people believe that they're gonna go to New York, but they don't. And so the British don't realize, well, they do quite fast, but they don't react really. And so that all leads, of course, to Yorktown at the end. And so here's one of the markers that shows where we are. And so there's episode 6 that describes the march that is going to go to Yorktown, but we're not going to watch that. Just a little beginning, here we go. But so the point is, of course, there's another long march that the French and Americans have to do. They leave here in waves, different columns start to march. And so they leave Greenburgh and the locations around here, they leave that encampment behind and they march all the way to Yorktown for several weeks. And of course, at the end, the naval victory of the French Admiral de Grasse secures the Chesapeake Bay, leads to the encirclement of Cornwallis with the French and American troops that have been marching in great harmony and very fast, which is the result of what they've done here and prepared here, and of course leading to the surrender of Cornwallis. There's a little painting that you might know, and Châteauroux is on both of them. Here we go. He's always in the background, which is great, because that's exactly his role. He was advising, whispering in people's ear. And of course, he's also on the Trumbull painting. And so I want to finish with why Greenburgh matters for this whole story. I said a lot from the arrival of the French, from all the mistrust, all these problems, the fact they overcame these issues. And so one of the main things that was cemented here for these 6 weeks was that trust between the French and Americans. Their strategy was clarified, of course. The alliance got operationalized. They started to train. They started to make sure they could win together. And so it made Yorktown possible. And so to finish with a little reminder of what we're in today, problematic transatlantic relations, you can look at this alliance from a military point of view, you can look at it from a historical point of view, but you can also get some lessons to learn how allies can work together, how they can forget all their differences and start to find a common cause and work for it and understand each other, even if they have a lot of problems or issues amongst themselves. You can overcome that and even win a war together. And so I wanted to end with that, but I also want to tell you that I'm working on this book right now. that is telling this full story, much more in depth than I try to fly through today. But I'm in the middle of the writing, and tomorrow I'll know who the publisher is, because there is what you call the bidding war is happening then. Yes. And so to finish all this, this is Châteauneuf in his last years, but I hope you now understand that Châteauneuf is this figure that was really an advisor to Washington. There was someone that created trust between an alliance that was not working well at all. He put a lot of effort in that, and his relationship with Washington was really the key to that. And that is one of the main storylines of my book as well. And right now, I will end, but I also want to invite questions from you. Thank you.
Eventually, the French Revolution, some have said that would have happened regardless of the success here. Do you think that one really did impact the other, per se? And when ultimately there was temporary peace, at least with the British, it seemed like the French wanted us to win, but they didn't want us to be too powerful. Like we were almost like a city-state of France. Do you believe in that, or?
Well, so I'm going to the second question after, but the first one is on the American Revolution, how much it impacted the French Revolution, and if the French Revolution would have happened without the American Revolution. That's, of course, one of these what-if questions that are hard to discuss. In the French Revolution, you could see arriving from a long period already. So there's lots of other factors contributing to the French Revolution that are totally unrelated to the American. But I would still argue that there's two main reasons why there is a clear link. First one is financial. The French were quite bankrupt after supporting the American Revolution. So, of course, our financial state was not very good already, like since the 7 Years' War and even prior, the French kings were suffering a lot. So there is that, but the American Revolution really tipped them towards bankruptcy. But you can actually see it. They spent so much money on it. And one of their main hopes was to get trade out of that, which the Americans, promised, but then they turned quite quickly back to the British. So that was a problem for the French, at least. So there's the whole side of that. But then there's also ideas. You could see in France that there was a serious, it's called l'Américomanie, a mania for America, that was actually propagated by mainly the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vergennes, that believed that if the French public would be behind the wall, they would at least be not that opposed to all these taxes. And so he started to spread the revolutionary ideals in the press, but it really came back because they started to get very excited about the ideas. So this was during the revolution, but then after, when all these officers came back, it became really fascination with a new order you could start, and not having this very absolutist monarchy, right? Monarchy had this new possibility. And so it was really inspiring. And some French officers, including Châteauneuf, brought back the ideas deliberately to show the French what can we change to prevent something. And he would even say to prevent our own revolution, which would become much more bloody than the American one. So there is a lot of links. But then at the same time, what you're asking, do the French want to sort of, keep the Americans down? It's true that there's some more, they're writing about the question and saying this continent can become very powerful. It will grow inevitably. The cities will grow, the ports will grow, the economy will become much more important. And Châteauneuf is himself warning that he's like, they're going to surpass us, so be careful here. So there are thoughts like that for sure. Yeah. Yes.
Throughout studying the revolution, I hear the words "letters arrive," "letters arrive,"
Oh, yeah,
"letters
yeah.
arrive."
Slowly.
But I'm fascinated how that actually worked, and
Yeah.
I know, like at Lexington, the postal writers did it, but overseas, how did that process work, and who was responsible for that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and it's one of the main themes is the wait for letters, as you're saying. The letters are not arriving. They're waiting for weeks, they're waiting for months. The French, when they arrive in Newport for about 6 months, do not receive any letter. So it's a real problem for fighting a war, of course, especially when your orders come from thousands of miles away. And so the postal system worked in a way that you could, there were several ports in France that would transport letters or packages mainly to North America, but you had a lot of stops in the middle, and especially there were a lot of British blockades, so they had to be sailed, if that's a word, but they had to be, of course. So there was a whole system in place to bring letters, mainly through merchant ships would transport them. There were also faster routes. There were a lot of different ways to get letters across the ocean, but one of the main issues were the blockades of the British, so they just couldn't. And otherwise it could have been intercepted, which you don't want. And so it's for many, many, many months that most letters just took to cross the ocean and back. And another problem was as soon as it would arrive, in order to arrive on land was a whole other story as well. So this is a question for, it's interesting if you talk to those that are in the military today, is like, of course you have constant, instant messages coming in. And so that led to a lot of autonomy for Rochambeau to make decisions on the spot because he had no orders almost. So it's an interesting question. Yes.
I just wanted to give you a little bit of an addendum to Iris's talk about this Grande Reconnaissance as they are marching through the woods, through no roads. Who guided them? And the main guide was John Odell. And that's why it is called Odell Rochambeau. There were 12 main Westchester guides. John and 2 of his brothers, and then 2 others who were his direct first cousins. So the whole story of why Rochambeau is in that house and then it becomes known as the Odell House is because John Odell was George Washington's main guide. So he was perhaps in the same room with Rochambeau and Washington because he was the one with the lantern on the pommel of his saddle guiding them through the woods at 2 o'clock in the morning. So
Wow,
I think, and we just found in the attic of Odell House a Revolutionary War trunk with the initials in nails, I.O., standing for Isaac Odell, who was John's youngest brother, also a guide. And we believe it was his trunk that would have been attached at the rear of his saddle on his horse as he guided all the troops through the woods.
Wow.
I think it's important
Yeah.
for the story.
Yes, for sure. Thank you. That is a very important part of the story. And we all have to go see the trunk soon.
The trunk will be one of our main displays.
Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned Netherlands and Spain having a role in the beginning, but then we never touched it again. What role did they play?
The role of Spain and the Netherlands. It's very important, actually. It's because I was focusing on the French, but of course, in the meantime, so we're talking about the Spanish first, that is in 1779. They decide to join the American Revolution, but way more indirectly than the French do. They sign an alliance with the French. So it becomes what you call the Bourbon alliance, because they're both Bourbon kings. And so, of course, Spain is equally interested in diminishing the British power, and they're mainly interested in South America, but especially Gibraltar is their key. And so anyway, that's a whole story. But the point is they're supporting the French indirectly and then American Revolution, mainly with money and with weapons, and also with their fleet at certain locations. And then the Dutch are also involved. From the beginning, they're sending secret gunpowder and also money and weapons through mainly St. Eustatius, which is a little island. And then from then onwards, up until 1779 and 80, there's a war starting between the British and the Dutch because of trade issues. And so that's when they really entered the war in the way that is not official. It's not an alliance like with the French, but it's mainly loans from rich Amsterdam or other places, bankers that are supporting the American cause. But what's interesting is they have loans. They don't give the money like the French did. And one of the reasons the French, they also had some loans, but the main point is it was like a donation, which is why they got bankrupt. But the Dutch signed very good contracts, like always. And so they got the money back. Well, that's a little side story, but it's really important to imagine that there's an international coalition that starts to fund and aid the Americans from the beginning onwards, and further on in the war more and more, of course. So
We have one more question.
How about we have a youngster here?
oh yes, hello.
How did the war in the Caribbean affect how the British moved their troops in comparison to quelling the Americans and stopping major campaigns?
Very good question. So the question is about how did the war in the Caribbean impact what happened here in North America, and especially how the British moved their troops. And that's very related to what we said about the French and the Spanish. because of course the Bourbon strategy was let's stretch out the British, let's overstretch them over the globe. So there was, of course, North America was one of the theaters, but another very important theater were the Caribbeans, as you say, because of course they were mainly known as the Sugar Islands. They were worth way more than North America was at the time. And so one of the strategies was to put a lot of naval power from both Spain and France over there, so that the British had to go back there to make sure they could keep mainly Jamaica. And then it would also distract from North America. They did the same all the way in India as well. They did the same in some African ports, and they did the same in Europe. They kept a big fleet and army ready in Northern Europe, mainly on the borders of Great Britain, to make sure the British would stay there. They would stay in India, they would stay in Africa, they would stay in the Caribbean. And so imagine their little army in North America was really endangered by all these movements. And for Yorktown, that's also really important. There's a whole other part of that story, but that's the Battle of Pensacola, which was one of the sort of distracting battles that required the British to move fleet, like ships and people, to these locations. So it's actually interesting, sometimes we tend to forget that it was really a global war, and that was part of the French and Spanish strategy. Thank you. Thank you so much.